I'm Rachel Horgan. Join me each episode as I sit down with a guest co-host covering the latest business stories in the Seattle area. We'll read the news so you don't have to. This is The Weekly. Okay, hey everybody. Just a quick thank you for anybody that tuned into last week's episode with Caitlin Brom, founder of Yonder Cider. It was really cool to hear all the positive feedback people were giving me, and it just made me feel good, so thank you. At the end of that episode, she said something about how important it is to be authentically yourself with your marketing. And that's really been kind of, bopping around my brain of how to kind of adjust my social media presence with The Weekly and just how to continue to show up in my personal brand with this. So if you didn't listen, go back. It's been great. But this week it's the GeekWire takeover, I'm calling it, because I'm sitting here with John Cook, the co-founder and CEO of GeekWire. Hello.
Hello, great to see you, and great choice in ball caps.
I was going to say.
We have kind of competing Seattle sports team ball caps today. You with the Mariners, and of course, the Seattle Supersonics. Yes.
I know. I was thinking about that. I was like, he seems like a casual guy. I feel like I can wear this hat and be okay. What's funny is that we first got together. So my first episode of The Weekly launched February 25th, and then you and I got lunch 3 days later. And I just wanted to, well, first of all, it's good to see you again. But also, it really meant a lot to me that you were there to kind of brainstorm, to bounce ideas off of. And you also told me that this was a good idea. And I think I really needed to hear that at that time. So,
that's amazing, because I usually tell people going into media it's a terrible idea. So you must be onto something.
I also want to say, I know we're recording in October, but you also agreed to be a guest like after that lunch. So you didn't know if this was going to be anything worth being on, and you said yes. So thank you again for
here we are.
I know, here we are. So speaking of podcasting, you also do a podcast with GeekWire. How is that for you? How do you like podcasting?
It's fun. We've done it now for, 15 plus years. Todd Bishop, my co-founder here at GeekWire, is really the lead on it and is really the podcast nerd. He was in here earlier checking out your equipment and seeing what was going on. But so I'm just kind of the tag along on the podcast for the most part. And but no, it's fun. It's a great way to share a different perspective on the news. Yeah,
I've listened to a couple episodes. If you haven't listened, go check that out. It's just called GeekWire Podcast. You can find it. Okay, so typically at this time, I would give a little bit more of your background and I'd ask why you're passionate about the news. But I'm trying this new thing with the articles, and one of the articles is going to be about you. It's going to be an interview about GeekWire. So we're just going to dive into it at that point. So our top 5 are, like I said, GeekWire, kind of how it came to be in the state of journalism. We'll talk about Uber being interested in acquiring Expedia. Microsoft and OpenAI's partnership is looking a bit rocky. And then an AWS CEO says some controversial things. And lastly, we'll talk about a laser weed company raising money. Sound good?
Can't wait. Love all these stories.
Well, they are GeekWire stories, so that does make sense.
They sound familiar.
Who wrote those? Okay, so if you don't know what GeekWire is, it's a national tech news site, and it was launched in 2011. So take me back to the beginning. So I had this idea for the podcast for a year before I could launch it, but you had this idea for GeekWire like for years and years ago. Well, you were at the PI, right?
Yeah, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which was one of the 2 daily newspapers in Seattle. And Todd and I were both very early digital journalists there. We were the first 2 reporters in Seattle that had blogs.
Oh.
And so we very much, and we were covering technology, so it made sense that we were early on to digital media. But we did interesting things with our blogs at that time. One of which was we branded them around our personal names. So it was Todd Bishop on Microsoft and John Cook's venture blog. And that was interesting at that time. It was just the easiest thing to call the blogs, frankly. Yeah. But what happened was our personal brands became attached with the subject matter expertise more than the newspaper's brand.
So you're like an early influencer.
No, I would hate to take on that term, but very early, I would say, in understanding the power of a personal brand attached to a media property, and also about going deep. One of the reasons that Todd and I decided we needed to start our blogs at that time, and this is 20 plus years ago, was that in traditional media, what we would call the news hole was shrinking because advertising was shrinking. And so the amount of space you had in the physical newspaper to actually put your stories in was diminishing pretty rapidly. And there were days that Todd and I had enough content just on the tech beat in Seattle to fill up the entire newspaper, probably 2 or 3 business sections in the
there's a lot
newspaper.
going on
Really,
there,
there was just so much going on. So the digital platform allowed us to have an endless capacity to cover the beat the way that we needed to cover it.
Oh.
And so in many ways, we were driven to make that switch to digital because of the deteriorating business model of print media. Mm-hmm. And then there were just so many other cool things about it that allowed us to connect with the community in deeper ways, whether it was through comments or a little more interactive style of journalism, creating lists. There were so many cool things that we could do with it. So we ended up trying to spin out what essentially became GeekWire with Hearst-owned PI. Mm-hmm. And for many, many reasons, that was going to go nowhere. And so decided that we needed to go out on our own. In fact, if you walk right out of the hall here of the GeekWire offices, you'll see on the wall there's a framed copy of what we call Project Seabreeze, which was our initial business plan that we had at the PI to spin out.
I love that.
And so the whole idea was that Seattle and the Pacific Northwest needed a digital media publication to cover the business and tech community in a much deeper way.
Yeah, I think that you were trying to do it with the PI, you tried to do it with another company, and then you had this moment of just, we got to do this on our own. Why was it so important to you to spin off?
I think you can just accomplish so much more when you're on your own. Mm-hmm. And if you have the vision for it and the passion for it, it really just makes sense to take it out and do it on your own. You're confined by, in the case of the more traditional media organizations we were a part of, you're confined by their bureaucracy, you're confined by their ways of doing things, confined by their traditional business models. And if you don't want to be confined by those things and think about things in a creative way, then it's really liberating to take it out on your own.
Yeah.
And we really thought there was an opportunity too. Seattle at that time was still, the tech community was very robust and established, but we did see that it was really starting to come into its own as a major technology center. And so there were a lot of parallels to what we were doing in New York and Silicon Valley, but there really wasn't anything quite like it in Seattle. And we thought Seattle deserved its own publication to cover this amazing community.
Yeah, it's very popular. I will say something that's different or unique about your publication is that no article is behind a paywall. So typically when you go to New York Times, Seattle Times, whatever, a lot of them, you could maybe read one article, but you often have to pay a subscription. Why was that a choice for you guys?
Yeah, we always had a multifaceted revenue model that we were considering when we started GeekWire. And we do to this day. We have 5 or 6 different ways that we monetize. But you're right. A paywall and a subscription plan is not one of them. I believe that news is meant to be consumed by a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I think the more confines and barriers you set up to people to access that content, the harder it is for them to engage with you and your brand and be a participant in the community. Yeah. And that's and you hear me say that word a lot, community, because that's how we think about GeekWire. It's not just a news site. Mm-hmm. We're trying to foster connections. We have events. We do a lot of things that try to build that community. And by having it be free and easily accessible information and high quality information, we think that's the path.
Yeah, definitely. So let's talk about journalism as a whole. I think the way people consume information is so different now. I mean, I'm watching like skits on TikTok of people acting out business news, and obviously a bunch of different ways in social media. So and we're also seeing a lot of traditional newspapers doing layoffs and running out of funding. How do you feel like GeekWire is able to stay successful and keep up with all these changes?
Well, I think you constantly have to evolve. We're small and scrappy. We've never really gotten rid of those startup roots. You can see the confines here.
We're recording in what feels like somebody's house, and it's just you and Todd outside, and you've got some computers and stuff like that, but it feels very startup-y. I love it.
Yeah, we love the space. I mean, we got a great view of the ship canal, 2 decks. It's awesome. But we've kept things pretty lean, but also are always experimenting and trying new things. I think that's what you have to do in media is you have to constantly be looking at ways to drive revenue. And I think one of the reasons why we're still around to this day is we didn't put all of our eggs in one basket with digital advertising or social media to try to build our brand. And build the business. We really focused on several different core areas, and we're constantly evaluating other areas on how we can drive revenue and build value around GeekWire.
Yeah. So last question on this. What are your overall thoughts on the journalism industry? Where do you see it going?
Oh gosh, I do hope. I'm not great at predictions, but I do hope the pendulum will swing back to a place
Trusting?
of what's that?
Of trusting the media?
Yeah. I mean, the pendulum needs to swing back in a lot of ways. Trust, just basic facts, and I would say high quality. I wish in our society there was a respect and a belief in the power of journalism. And it's really under attack right now in many forms. It's under attack from people in the media business who are not respectful of the profession and are not, I would say, operating in good faith.
Right.
It's under attack from political forces. It's under attack from the internet and a business model challenge. So all of these things are making it very challenging for media. That said, I'm hopeful, and I believe as a society, we are going to have to shift back to a place where we believe in fact. I mean, it sounds stupid to say, right? But believe in facts and believe in high quality journalism. And I don't know if we can get there, though. So we will see where this ends up. I mean, we're very much rooted in the belief that's how we build GeekWire. We try to be an ethical operating journalistic operation. And I think that's important. And we'll go down with the ship on that. If that goes away, then I guess there's no need for us anymore.
Yeah. I think about it in terms of this podcast. There was an episode where I thought I said something wrong. I thought I said a fact wrong. And then I went back and I was freaking out and I looked it up and I did in fact say it right. But it made me think, if I didn't, there's no oversight for me. Right? So whoever's listening I could say anything I want on this podcast, and not only me, but anybody on any podcast, where I don't have an editor or somebody saying I have to have 3 sources. I think there's just not as much oversight with things like making a TikTok about a news article or making a podcast about a news article.
Well, that's the thing. Everyone pretty much is a media organization now. Every single person, every single company. And that has created just a flood of content out there, most of which is poor. Poor in a journalistic sense. Yes. I mean, I guess if somebody wants to do something silly and fun on TikTok, sure, that's great. That's a different class. But people that are operating within, I'm doing the quote marks, news business, I think there should be a certain ethical framework they have to work from. And we're just not seeing it. That's frightening.
I agree. Okay, well, thanks for your thoughts on journalism. And speaking of the news, let's dive into it. So the first, or I guess second article, technically, is there's a report from the Financial Times that Uber is exploring a potential bid to purchase Expedia. They're just exploring their sexuality. They're not labeling it yet. And the difference in valuation I thought was interesting. So Uber is valued, as of today, when we're recording, is $165 billion and Expedia is about $20 billion. And I learned about this difference in valuation on your podcast, actually.
I know that. I was going to say, this sounds very familiar because we were just talking about this on the GeekWire podcast.
Something else interesting from the article and your podcast was that the Uber CEO, Dara, he was the Expedia CEO for 8 years and is still on the board. Do you feel like there's a conflict of interest, or how does that happen?
Well, he's certainly familiar with the company.
That's true.
So he knows the ins and outs of Expedia. I found this story really interesting, as Todd and I talked about on the GeekWire podcast last week. We're kind of excited for it to happen just from a journalistic standpoint, because these are 2 pretty sexy brands and consumer brands. And we haven't seen, at least in the tech sphere, a big acquisition like that in several years. So, and as you pointed out, there's this interesting DNA and common roots between Expedia and Uber, with Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of both, or who was CEO of Expedia now at Uber. So we're excited to track this, and we hope it comes to fruition.
Just because it'd be dramatic.
It'd be dramatic. It'd be fun to cover. But I have my doubts on whether this will actually happen. I think these large acquisitions are pretty challenging to pull off. And there's a reason why we haven't seen a lot of them in recent years.
Is part of it because the FTC, I know, has been kind of cracking down on too big of companies combining for lack of competition?
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. I think there's been a lot of hesitancy among big tech to go out and make a large move at this point. We'll see. Maybe things will change after the presidential election, and I'm guessing it will. So we'll see. This is certainly a story that I think would play out next year or even 2026 if it's coming to pass. There are reasons why an Uber and Expedia would look interesting together. I mean, it's kind of creating this, what they call the super app for travel. And there are a lot of connection points between Uber and Expedia where they could fill gaps for one another. We shall see. I'm excited to see this one play out.
Yeah, no, like you mentioned, I think it was you or Todd was saying how, when you go in an airport, that's Expedia. There's also the cars, Uber, like it's all in the same family. So it makes sense. My other thought on this was I wonder how the public perception is going to be, because I think there's this thought that Uber drivers aren't really getting paid very much, yet the riders feel like the rides are really expensive. And here Uber is being like, yep, we're going to take all this money that we're not paying the drivers and charging you, and we're going to go buy Expedia. I wonder if there could be some negative views on that.
Potentially, although I was just in San Francisco a couple weeks ago and had the opportunity to ride in a Waymo, so a driverless Uber of sorts. Mm-hmm. So you have to, and it was, I got to say, a wonderful experience and really changed my mind about the potential for this driverless technology. I had a similar experience when we were in Pittsburgh 5 or 6 years ago, and we rode in a driverless vehicle with thank God somebody behind the wheel, because it was definitely not ready for prime time.
Oh gosh!
So there's a whole discussion here on what the role of drivers will actually be in the future. I mean, you got to think in 5 or 10 years, is that even going to be a workforce for Uber or not?
Good point. Speaking of Uber, anything you want to say about, I know you've been covering tech for many years and Uber's had a lot of ups and downs. Is there anything you want to comment on their journey?
Well, I think what's interesting here and on this story too is that Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of Uber, when he was at Expedia, was very acquisitive. And so it's in his DNA to go out and buy up other companies. And so you could see that playing out potentially here as a next page in the playbook for Uber and how they really consolidate their place in the tech market. And I also was struck by the dramatic difference in market value between these two companies. That surprised me when I saw that.
Like, I know I'm ordering on Uber Eats, but dang, didn't know we're all ordering that much.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll move on to the next one, which is from bromance to frenemies, Microsoft and OpenAI. So OpenAI, I covered this in one of my earlier episodes, so I'm not going to dive into all the background here. But when you think of ChatGPT, that OpenAI is the company that brought us ChatGPT. Microsoft has invested a bunch of money into OpenAI, and they had this partnership. But then, what was it, last year? OpenAI's board fires their CEO, Sam Altman. And then he goes over to Microsoft, and they potentially, weren't they like about to hire Sam? And then the OpenAI was like, okay, fine, like we'll take you back. So there's all this kind of weirdness there. But what's happening now with this article, and you can kind of help me explain this one too, is that there was this exclusivity, and Microsoft was giving all this money to OpenAI, and now OpenAI is like wanting more money, but Microsoft is kind of hesitant on that. And Microsoft is like investing in other AI companies. And OpenAI is like, what about me? Was that kind of your gathering?
There's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
First off, I mean, and it is a convoluted story in part because of OpenAI's unique structure from the very beginning and a wild cast of characters that includes everyone from Elon Musk to Sam Altman to Satya Nadella to it is really kind of a soap opera what's going on here when you think about it from the beginning of this company to where it is today.
It started as a nonprofit?
Started as a nonprofit, which is very odd to have a nonprofit that is now worth, over $100 billion. And they're trying to make this transition from the nonprofit to the for-profit. And what does that mean for the existing business relationships? Microsoft, to its credit, was very early on in getting involved in putting a big bet here. And I think that's been smart for them. But Microsoft doesn't want to have all their eggs in one basket as it comes to AI. Personally, I think Microsoft is in the driver's seat here in part. And I think this is important to say as it relates to this AI boom that we're going through right now. Largely, my opinion is that it's been driven by the big tech companies. It's in their interest to promote AI. They have all the computing power. They have all the data centers, which is required to power this next generation of technology. So they're in a win-win situation on this. And I just think startups that are coming in, and you see this in the deal that OpenAI struck with Microsoft, a lot of that deal was tied essentially with credits for Microsoft Azure and Microsoft services so that OpenAI can continue to build their service because they need all that compute power and data center infrastructure from Microsoft. So it's a very interesting situation. This New York Times story, which, did have a great headline on the bromance, which, the fraying bromance was a pretty funny line. And I think there's something here where you have just a conflict between the up-and-comer and OpenAI and the traditional powerhouse and Microsoft, and who holds most of the cards. My sense is it's Microsoft because they're their biggest investor in OpenAI. They have all the computing power. They have made other bets in the industry and have brought on high-level technical talent to build out their AI team. So they have more options, I would say. So
yeah, and that's something I didn't quite understand before diving into this article is how much they need computing power from the big tech. And I guess now OpenAI is going over to Oracle to get some computing power. So I think you're right in that whoever has the computing power is in power. Another part of why this is going into frenemies is that Microsoft started hiring a bunch of staff from a company called Inflection, which is a competitor of OpenAI. So I think you're seeing kind of this if you're seeing other people, then I'm going to see other people, kind of like we're not going to be this tied partnership anymore.
Yeah. And Mustafa Suleyman was the leader of Inflection and now has been brought on to lead Microsoft's AI efforts. And I'm sure, in fact, there was an anecdote in the New York Times story about Mustafa yelling at some of the OpenAI staffers because they were not providing insights into the new technology at OpenAI fast enough to Microsoft.
Oh.
So it's going to be interesting to watch this play out. And Microsoft obviously has a lot of money invested. But at the end of the day, I think OpenAI is more dependent on Microsoft.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I move on, is there anything you want to say about kind of Silicon Valley companies coming into Seattle? Because OpenAI opened an office here. Pinterest has opened an office here. Do you think we're going to keep seeing Silicon Valley companies coming in?
Well, this has been one of the biggest trends we've covered at GeekWire over the last 15 years is what we call the arrival of the Silicon Valley tech giants. And, 20, 30 years ago, well, Microsoft is getting ready to celebrate their 50th anniversary. So they've been around for a while. And then Amazon, 25, 30 years. So the community was really defined by those two tech giants over the last 30 to 50 years. In the last 15 years, however, I think what's really changed the dynamic of this community is this arrival of these engineering centers for Google, Meta, Dropbox, Salesforce, the list goes on. In fact, we have a list on GeekWire of more than 100 of these engineering centers.
Whoa.
And it represents, tens of thousands of employees. Meta has over 7,000 people in the Seattle area now.
Dang, yeah.
So, these are significant operations. And the fact that OpenAI is setting up an engineering center and branch here is not a surprise, in part because of that relationship with Microsoft, but also so they can mine the talent that's here. And so it's a trend we have continued to see play out. I think it could be slowing down based on what we're seeing, just as teams become even more distributed. And every major company is already kind of here at this point.
Yeah.
So it's really changed the dynamic of the Seattle tech ecosystem, that it's not just a one or two company town. It's really 120 very large companies, and in addition to the startup ecosystem, which is generating new companies as well. So it's an interesting trend we pay close attention to.
Well, speaking of tech talent here, AWS, so Amazon Web Services, the CEO, Matt Garman, he took over in June and he had a town hall meeting and he says there are other companies around, referring to employees upset about the return to office. We've covered this a lot on this podcast, but Amazon is having them return to the office 5 days a week. He basically is saying like, okay, if you don't like it, go somewhere else. This is echoing a lot of statements from the CEO, Andy Jassy. I mean, all of leadership is on board. He's not, standing out with this comment. And he talks on.
Well, I guess you better be on board at this point, because
yeah.
what are you going to do if you're? Right. I don't believe what the CEO says.
Yeah, he'd be
that person's going to be finding another place to go work.
Exactly. He goes on about how it's important to have a collaborative environment. 3 days wasn't working because people were missing each other. To me, I'm like, I don't know if that's the real reason, but okay. And Microsoft says they're not following suit. So this feels like a pretty obvious hidden layoff situation, which is just like, if you don't like it, quit, because I kind of want you to, because I don't want to lay you off. Do you agree? Totally agree.
I had one person describe it to me as a silent RIF, so reduction in force.
Oh, okay.
This is a hot button topic, so it's not a surprise that it's come up on the podcast. And when I'm out in the community talking to people talk about this.
Yeah.
People are interested in it for multiple reasons, especially the Amazon news. So you have different parties here that have different things at stake. So you talk to people like the Downtown Seattle Association or the Seattle Chamber, and they're like, woohoo! Or retailers in the downtown quarter, like, woohoo! We're 5 days a week. This is going to change downtown. So there's like tons of enthusiasm there. Then there's the perspective of the leadership. So Jassy and Garmin and the others who I think they're certainly going to take the kudos from downtown, but that's not why they're doing this.
I was going to say, I don't feel like that's what
it is. And I'm not convinced they're doing this either for the reason that they think it is more collaborative and sparks more innovation within the company. I do think there is a hidden agenda here that they are trying to reduce their footprint, their employee footprint. And this is one way to do it without having a massive layoff. So that's going on. And then you do have the workers as a contingent here, which I feel for these folks because some of them were hired during COVID and this was the environment they knew and have set up their lifestyles and the way they work in that format. Now, of course, a company can choose to set the tone and change the rules. That's what a company can do. So I think if they want to do that, that's their prerogative. I just don't think they're being forthright in terms of exactly why this is happening. Right. And there are so many examples at a company like Amazon where people come to work, and let's say they come to work in an office, and they're not even speaking to anybody on their team. They have another colleague on the East Coast. They have other colleagues in Europe. And so you really need to question the value of working, and especially in a global company where people are that dispersed, if there is that value. I mean, I think for startups and a smaller, and this is also must be said, Amazon is fearful that it's day two. That you hear them talk about day one. Day one is the big mantra at Amazon.
Oh, I've not heard that.
Yes, it's this idea that it's still day one. We're still a startup.
Oh,
essentially.
That's cute.
And they live by this. Wow. And they are fearful when anybody labels or suggests, the page is turned, Amazon's now day two.
Yeah.
They are 100% fearful of this.
Okay.
And so part of this is a attempt, I think, by them to still say, we're still a scrappy startup. It's day one here. See, we're going to get our teams together and we're going to create all these cool and innovative things and get them in a room. And there is a place for that. I just think in a global distributed company where you have very established businesses, is that the place to be doing it? I mean, if they had like a skunkworks department and they were trying to create new products, maybe get them in the room and create things. But it's just interesting how they've approached this. And other companies are, I mean, we've been writing a lot about this. I've been talking to a lot of people about this. And I think what's interesting, companies are all over the map on this return to office and how it works for them. And I really think the mandate, especially of 5 days, is a little overbearing.
Yeah.
And you see, I mean, no one's liking this better than Microsoft or those other 100 tech companies that don't have as stringent of policies because they'll just gobble up the talent.
When you initially said that, for some reason I was picturing like a 45-year-old man being like, no, I'm still in college. We could still do kickstands. Like they're trying to be something that they're not, that they've outgrown. But so talking about these other companies, do you think there is enough opportunity for them to go somewhere else? Or is Amazon kind of saying like, good luck in finding another company? Everyone's laid people off too. Like, do you think there's opportunity?
It is an environment right now. I've seen some headlines out there where it's, I think Axios had one where it was, this is the no hire, no fire environment. So, which is basically a kind of a stalemate, and just and I think also, again, I think the election looming, I think that's playing a part. People are going to wait and see where that goes. But it has been this environment where there hasn't been a tremendous amount of hiring. There hasn't been a lot of firing.
Yeah.
A lot of the tech companies got through that in 2023, right-sized after COVID. Now they're kind of just waiting and seeing how it's going to play out. But, that said, there's always opportunity. If you're a, all-star engineer, and you don't want to go into the office 5 days a week, and you have 500 patents to your name, and you're you're one of the best engineers, AI engineers out there, there are going to be plenty of opportunities and companies that are going to gobble those people up. So it depends on the circumstances. I think we're going to see a reduced headcount at Amazon in Seattle over the years.
No, I agree. I also, it kind of makes me think about his leadership style. Like, I think words matter, and the way you phrase it matters. Like, I don't know, I had a boss at one point where we went from regular vacation to unlimited PTO. And so when that happens, typically if you quit, you get paid out your unused vacation days. When you go to unlimited PTO, you don't get paid anything. And he sort of basically said like, well, if you're quitting, like, I don't want to pay you anyway, like, good riddance, as if the 20 years of working there and just not using vacation because you're working there didn't matter. And I was like, oh man, bro, you said the quiet part out loud. And so that's where I get from Matt Garman saying this is like, he kind of said the quiet part out loud. So but
maybe intentionally.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, Jassy said it out loud, just in a more, in his memo, maybe a little more nuanced way. Yeah. But I think the message is going to be clear. And there are studies on both sides of this saying that hybrid work is people are just as productive as people that are in the office. I think for a smaller startup team, the founding team together makes some sense for that team to be together and they could be more productive. As companies get bigger, I think it's a little bit harder to go that route. So we'll see. Well,
like you said, I feel like we could all talk about return to office a lot, but let's move on to our last one. And it's a laser weed company that has raised $70 million, and it's called Carbon Robotics. To date, they've raised $157 million since 2018. I know this because of the GeekWire article. And also you interviewed the CEO on his rooftop, right?
Yeah, this is a cool company. And I got to say, when I started my journalism career, I started in northeastern Ohio, and one of my beats at the time was covering agriculture. So anytime there's intersection of agriculture and tech, I just get a little jazzed about those stories. And it's cool because it impacts what we eat and our food supply. And I mean, there's nothing more important than that. So, but Carbon Robotics, very interesting company, started by Paul Micasell, who's an experienced entrepreneur founder. He previously created Isilon, which sold to EMC, which was a storage company. And then he actually worked at Uber for a number of years, leading their engineering center here. And so super sharp guy with roots at the University of Washington. And the promise of this is pretty cool when you think about it. But the laser weeder essentially is a large contraption that goes through a field, and using AI and robotics will identify weeds at their very infancy and then zaps them with a laser. Wow. And so it eliminates the need for herbicides, and which makes our crops cleaner and healthier to eat, hopefully. And they are having great success building the product.
This is I'm not anti-AI, but I think people can tell from my episodes that I'm just like, do we need that? And this is one where I'm like, oh, cool, okay, yeah. Like I can see how AI technology is helpful in this situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, a lot of the buzz around AI is what it's doing in media and content, especially when you think about ChatGPT and creating marketing functions or, replacing marketing functions and content. But where AI and robotics intersects with health or agriculture or climate oriented topics, those are super interesting. And Carbon Robotics is definitely an up and comer and interesting company to watch.
Do you remember what I remember because I just watched it like minutes before I got here, but do you remember what he said, what he was going to do with the funding?
I know they are expanding internationally. And also what's interesting about this company is they want to expand their manufacturing in the U.S. and specifically in Washington State, out in Richland,
Washington.
Yeah. And Paul, the CEO, described it to me as essentially they're using kind of the Tesla model of owning the entire process from manufacturing to sales to support. And they're trying not to outsource any of that. And so they could be a big player in the ag tech space.
I think it's cool. So GeekWire does a lot of articles about like this cool startup raised this amount of money, this cool startup raised this amount of money. So I don't always cover it because I kind of want to wait and see if it actually works, or are they just good at raising money? So you've covered a lot of companies that have raised money. Do you have kind of a sixth sense on some like ones that'll make it, ones that won't?
Not really.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
I will say, much as a venture capitalist looks at the past track record of people, that is one thing to pay attention to. So, for example, I was one of the first journalists to cover Rich Barton and Lloyd Frank when they were starting up Zillow.
Oh.
And that was a company that I thought maybe it was worth paying attention to. Okay. I mean, they had previously started Expedia, very well regarded, sharp, knew what they were doing. And so sometimes you get a sixth sense with the people, for me at least.
Right.
For me, it's more about, wow, this person is really sharp. Either they've done it before and have had a lot of experience and they're attacking a new problem in a creative way. Certainly there are those serial entrepreneurs that have failed. But still, I think there's a certain personality there that can have success. Paul Michelson at Carbon Robotics is an example of that. And then there are just the really sharp kind of up and comers that you're like, this person is impressive. And I want to watch what this company does.
Yeah.
So for me, it's more of that connection point, I think, with the entrepreneur than it is with the product. And that, like, I don't know, the laser weeder.
Right.
It looks cool. It seems to be working, but I'm not out on the farm field, driving the thing around to know if it actually is zapping the right weeds when it's going through the field. I mean, that takes a whole nother level of expertise to analyze the product. But understanding the people and getting a sense of how they answer your questions as a journalist, I think you can pick up on some interesting insights.
Do you have an example of a company that surprised you? You either thought wasn't going to make it and made it, or you thought was going to make it and didn't? I don't know if you can think of an example.
Well, gosh, I mean, there have been hundreds of those companies.
Or just one maybe stands out.
I think for the most part, there's an optimism around a startup, especially after they've raised money, because like somebody believes in this to put enough dollars into them, and they believe it. And I'm even thinking back to like the .com days where people are like, oh, these were all really stupid ideas. But at the end of the day, you're seeing a lot of those things that have come to fruition, and they weren't stupid ideas. It was just too early, or the technology wasn't developed enough, or they made some missteps along the way.
Timing.
I'll tie it back to a story that you had on your podcast, I think in the last few weeks, where you had Vivek from Pioneer Square Labs on, and you guys talked about pure watercraft.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, I'm watching boats go by in the Lake Washington Ship Canal right here as we speak, and having electrified boats seems like a really smart, cool idea. They had strong backing. They had GM behind them. They had they had a lot of belief in their product and their vision, but they're in receivership, so
you never know.
You never really know.
You never really know. Okay, I guess you don't have a crystal ball.
If I did, I would just be not in the journalism business.
Billionaire, yeah. Well, John, I'm going to close with one more question that I ask everybody, which is, what's the best advice you've ever received? Or is there a piece of advice that you'd like our audience to know that you have?
Yeah, this one is special to me because the person who provided this advice unfortunately just passed away in the last few months. His name was Tom Huseby. He was a venture capitalist here in Seattle, very well regarded. Maybe not as well known, but I always had kind of a great rapport and connection with him. And he was a funny guy. He was really charming and just charismatic. And he told me one time, and this has always stuck true to me because I think it speaks to our story at GeekWire. He said, John, you can be successful by just hanging around for a long time. I love this because it speaks to persistence,
grit,
determination, figuring it out as you go. And what he's essentially saying is don't run out of money, which when you ask any venture capitalists, why do companies fail? They'll tell you because they run out of money.
Yeah.
And you can last a long time by just hanging in there and figuring it out. And really at the end of the day, that's GeekWire's story. I mean, we covered the technology community for 10, 15 years before we even started GeekWire. I've been doing this now for 30 years. I've stuck around for a long time.
Yeah.
Tried to be true to those journalistic ethics while being, true to the community and not burning bridges. And that's a fine line that you have to walk to do that and do that well. But I think if you can do that, you can find your paths to success.
I love that. Very well said. Thank you for sharing that. And for those listening, remember to check out geekwire.com for some great articles. Check out their podcast, go to their events, and support John and Todd. And thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Yeah. Speaking of events, come out to the GeekWire Gala, December 12th. Okay. That'll be my one plug.
I love it.
Big holiday party, Showbox Soto.
Ooh,
I'll have to get all your listeners out.
Sounds good. Thanks. This has been The Weekly, with production assistance from Nick Patry. If you liked what you heard, rate us and write a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We love listener feedback, so if you have any story suggestions, comments, or complaints, email us at info@theweeklyseattle.com. Make sure to check back next Sunday for the latest local business news. We'll see you next time.